All right, are we ready? Good evening, everyone. It's great to have you here in person and online as well. Thank you for joining us. My name is Russa Smith. I'm Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs here, but most proudly, I'm a professor of history here at Longwood. And it's really my delight to welcome you all this evening and to introduce our lecture series to you. This lecture series is named for Dr. C.G. Gordon Moss, and I want to spend a few moments telling you about who he was. Now, if you are a student or a faculty member at Longwood, Moss's name rings a bell because one of our newly renovated residence halls is named for him. Or you may have encountered him in the history exhibition in Radcliffe Hall, our new admissions building right across the street here. If you have taken a history course, as I know some of you have, you may have passed his portrait that hangs in the history department on the second floor of the rotunda, just by Dr. Isaac's office. That portrait was featured in a recent Greenwood Library program on Longwood's historic portraits. The presentation is available on YouTube, and I will say features Dr. Mike Utzinger from Hampton-Sydney College, who's a fantastic speaker. And of course, the portrait is right here to my left and to your right. Some of you in the audience, and I know at least two of you, may remember Dr. Gordon Moss from the school closings era and his time here at Longwood and in Farmville, or even from his later work here with the local Human Relations Council. And I will say, I am envious that you knew him. Dr. Moss served as a professor of history here at Longwood College from 1944 to 1969. He served as dean of the faculty, which at the time was the chief academic officer, from 1960 to 1964. These were volatile years in Farmville and Prince Edward's history. He was born in Lynchburg in 1899, served as a corporal in World War I in 1918, graduated from Washington and Lee University in 1921, and went on to earn his PhD in history from Yale University in 1929. During the 1920s, he also taught here at Longwood, which was then called the State Teachers College, and he met and married a Farmville girl. She was a woman. Sorry about that. A young woman who had grown up here in Farmville. How's that? As I said before, the school closings here in Prince Edward, which lasted from 1959 to 1964, was a transformative period for Dr. Moss. During that time, he became an outspoken advocate of reopening the schools and was one of the only white people in the community to do so at the time, and he did so openly. His faith as a member of the Episcopal Church and his training as a historian compelled him to speak out and work for equality and justice for all Americans, and particularly for the children in this county. In the summer of 1963, Dr. Moss was visited by Neil Sullivan, who would become the superintendent of the Prince Edward Free Schools here in the school year of 1963-64. And this was a kind of bridge opportunity for the children of Prince Edward County to be able to have some access to organized school while the public schools remained closed. And Neil Sullivan described Moss as a mild, quiet-spoken man who had suffered personal abuse and ostracism for his support of public integrated schools. And Dr. Moss told Sullivan when he talked to him, he said, quote, "I've been teaching American history for 40 years. I've been teaching that democracy and social justice are the greatest ideals of the American nation. I'd be a traitor to the thousands of students I've taught if I didn't take a stand for these ideals when the opportunity comes." And I'm sorry, every time I read those words, I get a little bit emotional. That observation by Dr. Moss inspired us to form this lecture series in 2014. And this lecture series features historians who study individuals like Dr. Moss. They study Americans who have struggled and fought for democracy, equality, and social justice. And through their work, These scholars also are citizen leaders and are agents of social change by sharing their work with us. And so it's a real pleasure to be able to bring scholars to campus who will share their expertise. And that is not my role tonight, that is Dr. Roberts' role. But really, programs like this help us to explore the rich history of citizenship and leadership in our democracy. It's a history that is central to our academic mission here at Longwood, and it's also central to the mission of the Moton Museum. And so I'm really delighted to be able to welcome you. I also have a few thank yous. As I said, this lecture series started in 2014 with kind of a harebrained idea that Dr. Coles, David Coles and I had, and we had support from the provost at the time. We've had the benefit of a generous donation by Sharon Coulter Gibb, class of 1964, to help us sustain this program. And I will confess that I've been a little bit distracted by various activities between 2014 and now, and I'm really grateful to David Coles and Cameron Patterson and Brent Roberts and for reviving the Moss Lecture and bringing it to us on an annual basis. So thank you, committee members. Thank you. So this really is a joint program of the Greenwood Library, the Department of History, Political Science, and Philosophy, and the Moton Museum. And I also want to thank the staff of the Greenwood Library for your work in helping to organize this lecture. You all are the best programmers on campus. And with that, I'd like to introduce, from the beating heart of campus, the Dean of Greenwood Library, Dr. Brent Roberts, to introduce our esteemed speaker tonight. It is great to have you, Dr. Newby-Alexander. Thank you, Brent. Also, this is so I didn't have to go after Brent. But I'm afraid Dr. Newby-Alexander does. Okay.
Good evening, my friends, and welcome to the C.G. Gordon Moss Lecture as the Dean of Greenwood Library. I'm very excited to welcome you to this event and welcome, is that the camera? Welcome all of you, my friends, online. Thank you for being with us. Can you tell how many people are online?
We got 8 on Facebook and about 4 or 5 on YouTube.
Oh, fantastic. We are almost viral. Oh, yeah. Oh, it's the new internet phenomenon. Well, it is my great pleasure, my friends, to introduce our speaker and also the snacks. I'm not sure which I should do first. I'm going to go ahead and invite everyone, first of all, just to remind you that after the event this evening, there will be a reception just in the foyer outside of the auditorium, where we've got lots of great snacks and lots of opportunities for chatting together about what we hear from Dr. Newby-Alexander. Also opportunities to purchase her book, and she will be happy to sign copies of her book. So that's very exciting. We're also express our gratitude to our friends at Barnes & Noble who are here selling her book this evening. So I have also one other thing to do before I introduce Dr. Newby-Alexander, and that's to point out this great display about C.G. Gordon Moss called A Legacy of Courage, which was put together by our archivists, and encourage you to take a look at that. There's also a digital version linked from the library's homepage, one of your favorite, I'm sure, listed one of your favorites on your internet browser at home, library.longwood.edu. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. I have 2 introductions. And one is one that I wove together from sources online, and then I have a much shorter one. So I will, let's just take a stab at it. Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, Professor of History, and Director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for African Diaspora Studies at Norfolk State University. She holds a bachelor's degree in American Government and African American Studies from the University of Virginia, and a PhD in American History from the College of William and Mary. Her publications include Virginia Waterways and the Underground Railroad, published in 2017, and African American History of the Civil War in Hampton Roads, published in 2010, and Hampton Roads, Remembering Our Schools, published in 2009. Dr. Newby-Alexander has served as a historical consultant for numerous agencies and initiatives, including Determined, the 400-Year Struggle for Black Equality exhibition at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. She has also served as a consultant for several museums, including the Moton Museum. My friends, please join me in welcoming Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander.
Trying to find a safe space to put my cup of water. Thank you so much for this invitation. Can everyone hear me? Wonderful. I'm going to put on my teacher voice a little bit, and as I talk a little bit more, you will hear my voice get louder, because when I talk about history, it is not only my passion, but it is the world that is ever changing. Every time you open up not just a library book, but you open up an archive. You open up someone's chest. Somewhere in the basement or in the attic, you find some history that you didn't know about. And it's exciting. It tells us about the people. It tells us about the life that they lived. It gives us a glimpse of something special about each and every person in our lives and in our world. I entitled this presentation, Have a Vision and Be Demanding: The Enduring Legacy of Leaders at the Robert Russa Moton High School in Farmville, Virginia. And I hope that this will give us a glimpse into people's lives, just a small glimpse. Some of this information may be familiar to you, but hopefully it will still be interesting. Things were fine so long as we stayed in our place. These sentiments by the Reverend L. Francis Griffin of First Baptist Church in Farmville were the observations of one of the African American leaders in a town dominated by white segregationist policies in mid-century Virginia. It was also a reflection of the weariness most black leaders had when advocating for equality before the law among leaders who never had any intention of fulfilling their promises. The town of Farmville is the county seat of Prince Edward County. With a population at that time of about 8,500, it was the largest town in a 50-mile radius. It was unusual in that it had a black majority, 52%, in the mid-century. But it was atypical because of the exclusively white leadership cadre that led it. As a rural community, income was low, and most citizens struggled financially. This ensured that the wealthiest citizens continued to prosper on the backs of everyone else. So it was not surprising that town officials were slow in building a high school for its white citizens in the 1920s, because most of the white elite tutored their children at home or sent them to finishing schools in the North. Not until 1939 did the school board relent in creating a high school for black children. And even then, all of the schools constructed for blacks were inadequate for the size of the black student population and built with inferior materials and with an inferior design. This was especially true for the Moton High School, constructed for 180 students, but by 1950 had a 450 student enrollment. To provide the veneer of compliance with the law, the all-white school board claimed that there were insufficient funds available to construct a new school. Instead, they paid for the quick construction of temporary buildings that were little more than tar paper shacks with cardboard walls, leaky roofs, improperly heated facilities, and no sanitary facilities. This situation was part of a pattern of inequality supported by the Commonwealth of Virginia for the purpose of maintaining disparity. In 1928, for example, Senator Walter George of Georgia intoned in an article that indeed, quote, no statutory law, no organic law, no military law supersedes the law of racial necessity and social identity, end quote. This idea was reflected very clearly in Farmville's political and educational systems and in Virginia's law. When a lawsuit was finally filed, the case revealed the real concerns of the ruling classes. The stated concern always focused on disruptions and potential violence. However, the real anxiety lay at the heart of the South's social and cultural landscape that made primary the maintenance of white dominance, racial marginalization of blacks, and a fear of racial mixing. There was also the belief that local blacks were contented with the status quo. Dr. Dabney Lancaster, president of Longwood College and the former state superintendent of education in Virginia, in explaining how segregation was a normal part of life, said, and this was in 1951, he said, quote, colored beans cannot compete with white beans. Colored potatoes cannot compete with white potatoes. Similarly, the editor of the Farmville Herald newspaper, J.B. Wall, in commenting on the lawsuit filed by the NAACP, that, quote, colored people didn't sue to end segregation. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People did. The National Association, the colored people were for equal facilities. The NAACP was not. This segregation business was instigated by some outside force. Of course, the reality was very different than the rationalizations provided by these white leaders. In 1945, J. Rupert Picot, the executive secretary of the Virginia Teachers Association, this was the state's Black Teachers Association, proclaimed that the Commonwealth was diverting tax funds paid by African Americans from their schools to the state coffers. 29 counties were specifically identified by him in an article published in the Journal and Guide on May 19, 1945, that specifically included Pittsylvania, Brunswick, Bedford, Northampton, Sussex, and Prince Edward counties. And it highlighted how they failed to distribute tax dollars that were paid by African Americans for schools. They failed to distribute anywhere from $4,800 to over $30,000 per year. And this went on for years and years and years. This situation was made more egregious by the false proclamations of the school board of Prince Edward County when, after the Parent-Teacher Association petitioned the board to make good on the equal component of segregation, the board, of course, indicated there was no money. Moton High School's principal, M. Boyd Jones, had the idea that the Moton High School had to serve as a training ground for democracy. Carefully fashioning an environment that supported a progressive educational outlook and expectation, he hoped to inspire students to transform their world into an equitable and fair society, a philosophy that he honed while an undergraduate at Hampton Institute and later a master's student at Cornell University. A proponent of John Dewey's philosophy that, quote, schools can be instruments for the democratization of society, end quote, Jones nurtured this intellectual inquiry by encouraging the expansion of the school's library holdings that included a diversity of books, but especially those focused on African American history. Yet he went beyond the intellectual to the tangible, creating an environment that promoted activism. The Reverend L. Francis Griffin, the First Baptist, recalled how Jones taught students to, quote, think for themselves and criticize, and more importantly, ask questions. It was within this landscape that a young woman by the name of Barbara Johns grew up. Perhaps it was this encouragement from a public school leader that inspired 16-year-old Barbara Johns to take an important and historic step. Johns, the niece of civil rights leader, the Reverend Vernon Johns, would be remembered for staging a carefully planned student assembly with his entire student population of 456 people participating to initiate the first student-led protest and strike in American history. Barbara Johns actually grew up partially in Washington, D.C., and the other part in Farmville, Virginia. Two very distinctly different communities. In so many ways, this was a simile for the two important people in her life who framed her perspective and outlook. Her father, Robert, who was a very quiet and kindly man, and her uncle Vernon, a firebrand advocate for civil rights, as well as an articulate preacher. During the Second World War, the two men ran a store in Farmville, where Barbara had an opportunity to observe how the two men navigated their lives and articulated their perspectives with those coming into the store. Her uncle Vernon received the most attention from Barbara and others because of his intellectual scope and knowledge. She even engaged in arguments with her uncle and honed her talents as an intellect, reading classic novels, autobiographies, histories, especially those about African Americans, but most especially about how she loved arguing with her uncle, and sometimes won. One day in 1950, when taking music lessons from Inez Davenport, the Moton High School's English and music instructor, Barbara Johns bemoaned the inadequate conditions at the school and the fact that a new school had been promised for 5 years. Students complained that the overcrowding was so bad that just breathing was difficult. She said, and she later apologized for using a cuss word, but she said, "I wish to hell something could be done about it." Davenport responded, "Do something about it." Stunned by the challenge, Johns decided to act. By late autumn in that year, Johns approached Carrie Stokes, president of the student council at Moton High School, and her brother John, who served as the council's vice president. John was especially accomplished, just having been elected state president of the New Farmers of America. That was the sort of Jim Crow version of the 4-H club. He was also the school's top student, a track star, and served as the business manager for the school newspaper. For Carrie and John, their conversation with Barbara opened their eyes for the first time. Shortly thereafter, Johns met with other students who were similarly convinced by her that something needed to be done by them, that could not be accomplished by their parents. Barbara Johns reportedly said, quote, "Our parents ask us to follow them, but perhaps, as the Bible said, a little child can lead them." She added, "We could make a move that would broadcast Prince Edward County all over the world." After recruiting even more students into their tight circle, they began to do some reconnaissance at the PTA meetings and the school board meetings to understand if any progress was being made to remediate the dire situation in the schools for African Americans. Things were clear by year's end that no progress would be forthcoming. So the plan was that by the spring, the students would stay out on strike until the school board agreed to build them a new high school. However, this move necessitated absolute solidarity. Clearly, Johns had a vision. Reverend Griffin, who was president of Moton High School PTA, thought they had made progress with the school board, choosing a site, negotiating a price for the land that was compatible with the budget. However, in February of 1951, the group was informed that they no longer needed to attend any of these school board meetings and that the county board of supervisors would purchase the site. Of course, you know the story. By April, nothing was done. And all of a sudden, people began to have amnesia. So careful then were the preparations by Barbara Johns that they coordinated this scheme. The principal, M. Boyd Jones, was not present on April 23, 1951, when Barbara Johns decided to take action, because they had a muffled phone call to him telling him there was something going on at the bus station and come down because one of the students was in trouble. And so, of course, he took off running down there. Meanwhile, Johns had her group take messages to each of the classrooms, letting all the teachers know there was going to be a student assembly. It was going to be a short student assembly. Once the group had gathered, Johns turned and excused all 12 of the teachers at Moton High School from the assembly hall. And somehow she managed to convince 12 adults to leave the room with 456 students in attendance. So she had some miracle dust that I wish I had a little bit of. Anyway, she was afraid that the students, that if the teachers stayed, that they would lose their jobs. And that's why she asked them to leave. And that's why they left. Barbara Johns obviously was a very persuasive speaker, but she also had a very quiet manner about her. But her voice was made of steel. She informed her fellow students that blacks were not given their fair share under the separate but equal formula and never would unless forced. Therefore, they had to take a stand, they had to have a vision for equality, and they had to demand change. As the students lined up for a whole month, imagine high school students protesting for an entire month and showing up every day. That in and of itself tells you a lot about the conditions, about the desperation, about the commitment. They would carry placards that read, "We're tired of tar paper shacks. We want a new school." They understood that by going on strike, they risked being jailed because they were violating the state's compulsory school attendance laws. Determined to continue, the students responded, "The jail is not big enough for all of us." Principal Jones made efforts to have the superintendent of schools, Thomas J. McElwain, meet with the students leading the protest. McElwain initially refused, convinced that Principal Jones was really the instigator. McElwain remarked that, quote, "The students had little to do with it. I went by the school on a number of occasions, and the principal would be behind closed doors with the minister and the county agricultural agent. I found out that they planted someone at the bus station to say that there was trouble down there and so forth, and I told Jones I expected him to straighten out the situation. I don't have any question that it was a put-up job, an undertaking on the part of a very few. I don't think the Negroes in the county generally supported this move," end quote. There may have been some truth to McElwain's position, only in that it appeared Jones turned a blind eye to what the students were planning. However, McElwain was inaccurate in believing that the students were merely pawns in an adult conspiracy. Barbara Johns confirmed that once the strike began, she had frequent meetings with the principal, who told them that the students were wrong to do it this way and that they couldn't succeed. He pleaded with her to stop the strike and return to school. Johns, however, wanted Jones to stand up for the students. And eventually, after a very heated discussion between the two of them, Jones said, well, continue on, continue on. Nevertheless, the day after the strike began, McElwain actually did meet with the student committee, and there were hundreds that showed up, so he had to move the meeting to the courthouse, where the students presented their demands. McElwain, in typical fashion, threatened them with expulsion and told them their teachers, even their teachers, would be fired if they didn't go back to school. And when that didn't seem to move them, he turned to bribery. And he said, well, we'll give you a new school. So you go home, go back to school, stop all this nonsense, and we'll give you a new school. Well, this meeting actually convinced the students that the white leadership had absolutely no intention of meeting their demands voluntarily. Following their exchange with McElwain, the students asked the Reverend L. Francis Griffin to advise them on the next steps. As president of the local chapter of the NAACP and pastor of, as I said, of First Baptist, Griffin put them in touch with NAACP attorneys Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson. They began meeting at various locations, including the high school, Griffin's church, as well as other places, with hundreds of students and adults meeting with them at different points in time. Most of them who attended basically said, this is the hill we will die on. We want an end to segregation and discrimination. Initially, Oliver Hill thought that because of the intransience of the whites in Prince Edward County, that, quote, there was no less a promising place in all of Virginia to wage a fight for equal schools than in Farmville. Indeed, when Oliver Hill was working on the school equalization case in Cumberland County, Virginia, a town similar to Farmville, and suggested that the black children can simply go to the same school as the white ones, one of the school board members jumped up and shouted, the first little black son of a bitch that comes down the road to set a foot in that school, I'll take my shotgun and blow his brains out, end quote. Hill and Robinson believed that unlike the more militant black leadership that existed in cities like Richmond and Norfolk, that Prince Edward County resembled more the antebellum South than 20th century Virginia. He saw the blacks as long-suffering, but without the means to really sustain a radical lawsuit. After a spirited debate in which the attorneys asked the students to bring their parents with them to the next meeting, Hill later remarked that he just didn't have the heart to tell them to break this up. However, the commitment and passion of the students, their sophisticated organizational skills, the structure that they created, made an impact on these attorneys. It changed their minds completely. In fact, he said, you got to have your parents come and petition to file this lawsuit. The next meeting, 1,000 people showed up. They were done. The NAACP lawyers agreed then to endorse the lawsuit, and of course it became the Dorothy Davis versus County School Board of Prince Edward County. And of course this lawsuit attacks segregation on behalf of 117 Moton High School students. The request in the lawsuit was for an end to segregation. That was something the NAACP attorneys were going to insist upon. Not just equalization, because after 75 or more plus years, Virginia was not intending to equalize anything. It was going to be integration or nothing. Not surprisingly, they asked Barbara Johns to make sure that the students returned to the school so that the focus would be on the lawsuit and not on the student strike. She did agree to doing that once the lawsuit was filed. But of course, retribution over that lawsuit was swift in Farmville. Barbara Johns and her family received repeated death threats, forcing her parents to finally send her to live with her Uncle Vernon in Montgomery, Alabama, who at that time had been the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the one that Martin Luther King Jr. would eventually become pastor of. A cross was burned on the grounds of Moton High School. The all-white county school board fired the principal, M. Boyd Jones, and a teacher who was the aunt of one of the students and whose husband was a member of the NAACP. You know, in the 1950s, the state began to investigate who was a member of the NAACP, and if you worked in any public situation, you were fired for being a member of the NAACP. In addition, the Moton High School teacher Vera Allen, whose daughter Edwilda was involved in the strike, was also fired. Later, that county official that McElwain mentioned, John Lancaster, he was the county farm agent. He too was fired, ostensibly because of his support of the strike and his efforts as the Moton PTA president to build a new school. Principal Jones eventually moved to Montgomery to pursue his doctorate at Alabama State College. After all this, the board tried to bribe the plaintiffs to withdraw the lawsuit, announcing plans to build a new Moton High School, hoping that would quell all the legal challenges and ensure no further protests would ensure. Overall, the pressure was exerted on all African American adults, a common practice in the South. Threats of job loss, violence, social and economic intimidation followed. Soon, resistance emerged from all quarters, including some from within the Black community. Some members of Reverend Griffin's church lobbied unsuccessfully to have him removed as the minister. Griffin even had police surveillance trailing him and his associates. Economic measures were leveled on him and his family by merchants, demanding that any debts that he had must be paid immediately. However, Griffin threw down the proverbial gauntlet in a fiery sermon in which he intoned he would sacrifice his job, his money, his property for the right, the principles of right. Griffin went further with both a promise and a challenge when he said, "And I'm willing to die rather than let these little children down. No one is going to scare me from my convictions by threatening my job." As expected, Griffin left the church with the full support of his congregation. Predictably, the school board denied the NAACP petition to desegregate the schools and suddenly found the money to build this new Moton High School. Nevertheless, the lawsuit proceeded on May 23, 1951, in federal district court. It was too little, too late. The lead plaintiff was Dorothy Davis, and it was because her name came first. Years later, Dorothy Davis married and moved to Queens, New York, became a nurse. And she said, in years later, talking about that event, she said, "We decided in order to get equal facilities, we're going to have to go on strike." And we did. And that's how it first started. At the R.R. Moton School, they had shanties for us. And the white kids had modern schools and better facilities, end quote. By February of 1852, the case was reviewed by a 3-judge court. The Prince Edward County defense was led by the future governor, J. Lindsay Allman. And he argued the typical strategy of white Southern leaders when confronted with violations of separate but equal doctrine, saying, "We're pleading no contest, yes, we're guilty, my bad. We're going to promise to, help out, correct all the disparities. But, segregation must be defended because it's customary, it's moral, and it's lawful." Predictably, the judges ruled in favor of the county, stating that the separation of white and colored children in the public schools of Virginia has for generations been part of the mores of her people. This ruling was expected, and so the NAACP lawyers simply readied their appeal to the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court. The NAACP was litigating similar cases in South Carolina, in Kansas, in Delaware, in Washington, D.C., all throughout the 1950s, and they bottled up all of these cases into one as a class action suit called the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And of course, there were over 167 plaintiffs. And of the 100, think about this, of the 167 plaintiffs, 117 came from Farmville. Of the 167 plaintiffs in this class action suit, 117 came from right here. In the hope that they could persuade the plaintiffs to drop the case, the Prince Edward County leaders put together plans to prove how effective separate but equal really was. This was, of course, their stopgap measure to do what they feared the most, which was to have an integrated situation. The new Moton High School opened in 1953 with an auditorium, a gymnasium, a cafeteria, all the things that the original Moton High School did not have. Their efforts failed. African Americans had a vision and were now demanding a remedy. Their patience, they thought, was soon rewarded because on May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that separate schools were inherently unequal and that segregated schools were unconstitutional. The court just didn't tell you how you were going to do it. So a year later, they had the "with all deliberate speed" statement. And I think of "with all deliberate speed" kind of like a word that I hate, soon. You all know about soon. Soon never happens. So "with all deliberate speed" proceeded just that way until there was intervention. Now, at first, after the decision, Virginia leaders grudgingly accepted the court's decision. Governor Thomas Stanley called for calmness as the state figured out how to implement the new law. But of course, we had Senator Harry F. Byrd, who warned that the court's decision, quote, "is the most serious blow that has yet been struck against the rights of the states in a matter vitally affecting their authority and welfare. In Virginia, we now are facing a crisis of the first magnitude." Now, I can actually pull that quote today from any news item. Very, very similar, because people don't move too far from the past. The past is still with us today in so many ways. In Prince Edward, white leaders bristled at the idea of the federal government telling them how to run their public schools. Wall, the one I quoted earlier, wrote in the Herald editorial, quote, "We therefore conclude that public education as it is presently constituted had been undermined and toppled to fragments by the general decision of the Supreme Court. We submit that Virginia has not abandoned public education. The Supreme Court has abolished it," end quote. For African Americans, the Brown case was viewed as a victory for equality and hope that the government was finally on their side. Southern whites, however, viewed this decision as an intrusion by the federal government on their way of life and a specific regional attack on the South from the North, although the North had its own segregation. The reaction by Prince Edward County officials was to shut down the schools. That was an unexpected move as far as the blacks were concerned. They didn't think they would go that far. But of course, we know they had a remedy for the white population, and that was to take public funds and open up private schools for free for white students only. Then, of course, the massive resistance strategy that Harry Byrd talked about was initiated and assisted by another future governor, Mills Godwin. Eventually, those actions were ruled unconstitutional, but that didn't stop them. By 1956, the Stanley Plan was passed by the General Assembly, which gave the governor the power to close any school that integrated and stipulated that school districts that integrated would lose state funding. By September of 1958, when the Virginia Supreme Court ruled that schools in Charlottesville, Norfolk, and Warren County had to desegregate immediately, the governor closed all the schools. Prince Edward was also under a court order to integrate, but the school board wanted to stay and appealed to the Supreme Court. The court turned down the appeal and returned the case to the district court, Judge Sterling Hutchinson, who ruled in August of 1958 that Prince Edward had until 1965 to integrate. So he was giving them a 7-year pass. Because the county refused to fund the public schools, black students in Prince Edward County went without education for 5 years, while legal challenges bounced between courts. Some went to live with relatives in other states, and some were tutored by volunteers or simply stayed home. White children, however, attended the new private school created by their leaders and funded by state tuition grants and private donations until they had to stop that because it was actually illegal. And so only for those who could afford it, paying a little tuition, were they able to continue going to school. In May of 1964, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed with the plaintiffs in the Griffin versus County Board of Prince Edward County case, with Justice Hugo Black writing the following, quote, "The time for mere deliberate speed has run out." He noted, quote, "There has been entirely too much deliberation and not enough action. The constitutional rights of African American children seeking a fair and equitable education are being ignored." The closing of the school in Prince Edward County dramatically affected the lives of all of the residents, but especially African Americans. And this impact was not just with the teachers who lost their jobs or the children whose educational lives were severely impacted. It was also the countless family incomes that would be impacted generationally because of the lack of a publicly funded educational system. And even those who could send their children to a different county to be educated, there were dollars missing from their meager incomes that they could never regain. It's important to remember the sacrifices of those involved with this important history, such as Barbara Johns, M. Boyd Jones, Carrie and John Stokes, Dorothy Davis, and the Reverend L. Francis Griffin, but also the countless people who are unnamed, the organizers of the strike, the training center organizers, the parents, all the students, the grassroots efforts. During this 8-year school shutdown, the students who joined in the protests, championing their rights as citizens of America, all of these individuals need to be named. They need to be documented, like the Vietnam Wall. We need to have a place where we can touch the names of the people whose lives were impacted. Those individuals who walked out, who were a part of the walkout and lockout generation, they should be commended for their vision, for their bravery, and for their demand for justice. It is this history, however painful and shameful, must be remembered and told. To do otherwise is to surrender to the very definition of political indoctrination and fear. Indeed, the cycle we see in America repeats our mistakes In the same way that our current governor here in Virginia wants to once again use the tools of government to promote injustice and historic amnesia. Yet resilience is the real story here. And thankfully, forward-thinking people like Martha E. Forrester Council of Women were responsible for preserving the historic Moton High School to become a National Historic Landmark in 1998 and a museum in 2001. And I have to say that Virginia needs to stop tearing down its shameful past. We have too long torn down every single slave jail, every single place where human beings were part of the human trafficking that filled our coffers here in Virginia. For too long, we have torn down reminders of what we never should forget. Walking through the corridors of the Moton High School building and seeing the conditions endured by over 450 students makes an indelible imprint. The walls of the school tell us stories, and the Moton Museum interprets that story for future generations. And for me, that story begins with understanding that in order to change our world, we must have a vision and not be afraid to be demanding. Thank you. And I believe there's a question and answer. Certainly.
So I know Boy Jones joins the faculty at Norfolk State. Did you ever have an opportunity to connect with him before he passed?
I did not. I knew of him as a child, and my parents knew him very well. But, you know, it was from a child's perspective, so I unfortunately did not. But thank you for bringing that up. Any other questions? Yes.
So with Farmville being such a small town as it is now, I know it used to be a lot bigger than it is, but not a lot of people know about the Moton Museum. I know you teach at Norfolk, so what like brought you to the story of the Moton High School and the museum and everything that happened?
Could you repeat the question for the folks?
Yes. The town of Farmville is small, and I'm all the way in Norfolk. And what got me interested in this seemingly small town story? The small town story is an actual national and international story, in part because of what Barbara Johns did, leading the first student strike in America, in part because it became part of the Brown versus Board of Education class action suit, but also because it's one of the many similar towns in Virginia that had the same thing happen to them over and over and over again. And there's a continual legacy of that still negatively impacts people. And so as I've expanded my research over the years to look at different aspects of Virginia's history, when you're a historian and you study African American history, you're actually supposed to know everything. And so I actually had people challenging me, asking me questions. I don't know that. Let me go find out. So the story became very intriguing to me, and I wanted to know more. And the people who were involved were similar to other people that I'd read about who were involved. So the similarities drew me in, but then each, of course, has a uniqueness. Now, I believe Griffin was actually born in Norfolk, or was from Norfolk for a while. And so I shouldn't be surprised, but I'm always surprised that people in Virginia kind of move around. And you know, I've always said, sort of only partially sarcastically, that everybody in Virginia is related to everybody else. But you know, when you start doing some research, you find a lot of that is really true. If people have been from Virginia for at least, you know, their families have been here for at least 200 or 300 years, yeah, you're probably related to a whole lot more people than you realize. Because most of these places are small towns, and the railroads connected people. The institutions connected people. And there was a huge network in Virginia of African Americans who had different institutions that they were all involved with, all connected by these railroads. And that story has not yet been told, by how connected it was and why it was connected in the way it was, and how those connections meant that people were intermarrying with different family groups and seeing the larger picture as opposed to just a very small regional picture. And so I know that was a long answer to a very short question. Yes?
Regarding the student walkout, I've always been interested in the timing of it. Do you think there was any, in terms of the timing, that the school bus crash that happened about a month or so beforehand, which a number of students were killed, and you know, there have been complaints about the school buses being in poor condition. Do you think that played a role in the timing? I mean, evidently they've been discussing it prior to that.
Yeah, I think maybe that was the trigger. They were already planning something, and even the previous year in I'd say around October, they were talking about in the spring they were going to conduct a strike. So I think that may have been the trigger, as opposed to the only thing, you know, because we never do anything by chance. Everything that anyone does is motivated by long-term issues and then short-term triggers. And so, yes, I agree that the death of students, the busing issue, you know, was a big trigger.
And related to that, there's at least one account I've read that there was a student who claimed that a teacher was aware of it ahead of time, that there had been discussions between a student and a teacher. Did you come across anything related to that?
I have come across sort of vague references that while they were keeping it under wraps, that there was an environment of silence, because if the teachers were really not aware, I don't think they would have left the auditorium. And I don't think that the principal was aware that that was the day they were going to do something, but he knew something was going on, because they built the placards at the school. They stored them at the school, and the principal ran what I heard was a tight ship. So he knew everything that was going on at that school in terms of, you know, those kinds of activities. And so I'm not surprised if everyone had gotten wind that the students were going to do something. They probably just didn't know the time. But they knew it was going to happen. Any other questions? Yes?
You had mentioned that for too long we've been trying to get rid of painful reminders of the past. And I know recently here at Long we've changed the names of several buildings to reflect this idea of moving forward and letting go of the past. Do you object to that sort of name changing, or do you feel that it's important to recognize the issues of the name, what it stands for, and why it's important to change it?
So there are actually two things going on with the why there are all these name changes, such as renaming schools in honor of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and replacing them with other names. The reason why those buildings were named the way they were, to honor those individuals, was all part of this cult of the lost cause. It was designed to change the way we understood our past. So in my mind, there's a messaging that's going on with the naming of those buildings whether it's bridges, tunnels, highways, those kinds of things. This is all about renaming the past. If the names of other groups of people, African Americans, Native peoples, and so forth, were all part of the naming, maybe that would be a little different. But the idea was that what actually happened didn't happen, and we're going to honor these people and hold them up as heroes. Never mind the almost 50% of the rest of the population. We don't care about them. We're not going to honor any past that involves them. We're going to honor a past that didn't exist, but we are recreating in our minds. That to me is different than talking about really honoring those areas that remind us of a past that we prefer to forget, the inequality that was enforced by law, the human trafficking that went on by law for generations, the ongoing trauma that we still inflict on people. In fact, this tendency of our society to take leaders who are African Americans and name low-income housing projects after them is to me appalling. Because we're then now associating something that we see to be not uplifting with a person who did exploits. And so there's a subtle demonization of that individual while we're saying we're trying to honor them. And so it's that racialism and that racism that's a part of what we have been doing for generations in our society. To be able to talk about our past. You know, I tell people all the time, unless you have a secret to tell, you didn't live then. You know, if we're talking 150 years ago, you weren't alive during that period. So what do you care? Why is it hard to look back on the past without putting yourself there and somehow wanting to take ownership and be protective of that past? We all have skeletons in our family closets. Anybody in here not have a skeleton? If you raise your hand, I'm warning you ahead of time, if you raise your hand, it's because you don't know anything about your family. Because every family has a whole closet full of skeletons. People don't want, no, you don't talk about that person. In fact, that animated feature in Kata, you know, they had that song about one of the family members that we don't talk about. You all have learned a little bit more than you want to know about me. I love animated movies. And so all of us have that kind of thing in our past. But does that mean that's who you are? And are you somehow moving your family forward by hiding that secret? By maintaining that secret, they're trying to silence your family about telling that secret. I remember years ago I had a student who was part of the Edwards family in Virginia, part of the family moved to North Carolina. And he was in my research class, and he told me he was convinced that there was at least one black person that his family had children with. He was white. And he was going to find out who that was. He knew, he was on the blood trail. And then when he found the person, family members came up to him and said, "You can't tell that story." And then he found out how many people in his family actually knew the story. And they were determined to keep it quiet. And he was like, "Why? You weren't involved in this, but these are our relatives. We need to acknowledge this. We need to move forward." And he was just about pummeled by his family, by some members of his family, but he published it anyway because he was determined to go down a different path. But the family generally was dead set in protecting and hiding that past that they considered to be so shameful that they were willing to attack other family members for having the temerity to talk about it. And so when we look at our past, I think it's important that we kind of remove all of that foolishness that we have about protecting things we're ashamed of when we weren't involved in it at all, and talk about it, because those things have impacted people. And if we're going, you know, human beings live, they're social beings, and if we're living in a society and we want to live well and peacefully in a society, we have to acknowledge people's pains, people's joys, people's heartaches, people's exploits. When you do, when you take the time, then you become the kind of society you say you are. Right now, we're more aspirational than real. And so our past has to be truthful. That's the first thing. And then we have to acknowledge and reveal. And the younger people, they don't care. They find it interesting. And they have something that most people forget they have. It's called a smartphone. And they can learn a lot of things on that smartphone. And they'll fact check you while you're talking. So you're not going to stand up in front of young people. Those of you who are in the audience, you know what I'm talking about. You will fact check people quickly. And if you can't find it, you're going to say, well, where'd you get that from? I want to find out more about that. That's the society and the world we live in today. It's people in my generation and before who don't understand that. And they're the ones holding us from truly entering the 21st century. Again, a long answer to a short question.
We do have a question coming from the live stream. Monique asked, Virginia has worked to develop the curriculum for African American studies. Most of work has become an elective course through virtual Virginia, as few districts offer it as a course within their general curriculum. Are you aware if there has been some progress to African American studies being an integrated component of Virginia and U.S. studies?
So I was actually the co-chair of that commission. And I am troubled that the day that our new governor was inaugurated, Executive Order number 1 was to stop talking about that history. And I really wish that everyone would stop calling any discussion about African American history as critical race theory. Because all they do is they tell us how stupid and ignorant they are. But it's also a tactic, because they know that a lot of people don't bother to find out anything, and so then they just repeat. And I always tell my students, it's bad enough when you don't know, but when you parrot another person who doesn't know, what does that make you? What's worse than being stupid? Just plain dumb. And so people are parroting this thing, but I always say this: what is wrong with critical race theory? There's absolutely nothing wrong, because there's a word called a theory. And if you understand the definition of a theory, it's an idea that's being proposed. It's not necessarily proven. However, the theory is based on the laws that have been passed and enforced in places like Virginia. And I always tell people, go to A. Leon Higginbotham's book, In the Matter of Color, and then come back and tell me that there is not a long history and pattern of legal injustice against people of African descent, when in 1642, Virginia decides to tax black women and black women only, not white women, for their labor. Double taxing black families, 1642. And then they came back a year later and said, and by the way, this law does not apply to white women, only black women. Only black women. And so when you see this, and we won't even talk about the casual killing of black people law in 1669 that said that any white owner could casually kill their slave if they resisted. And it was not considered murder. So a white owner could rape his enslaved woman, and if she resists, he could kill her. And it's not considered murder. And then 2 years later, they passed another law allowing any white person who's threatened to kill a black person with impunity if they felt threatened. These are legacies that we have that's still with our society because we're too busy hiding our past from ourselves and acting as if everything that happens is a recent thing. And so that's all the critical race theory is talking about, but it's called critical race theory because it's a law school initiative in which Derek Bell and later others said, we need to educate lawyers about this past so that they can understand how to better defend their clients in court and hopefully work to change those laws. 2 years ago, Governor Northam initiated a commission to look at the inequality in the law. And the commission found over 100 laws still on the books that actually had the language of discrimination in it. And then it was they found other laws that the governor renewed this commission for another year to start looking at more laws having to do with economic discrimination and housing discrimination, because there were so many laws out there. And these laws being on the books, some of them active, continue to harm people. And so, this idea of critical race theory is important because our society is generally uneducated. And the commission is made up primarily of attorneys and judges. And all of them said they were shocked. They never knew that those laws were still on the books. They did not know because the law schools were not teaching them about this. And so the critical race theory was about teaching the attorneys about the reality so they could better defend their clients, so that they understood the language that was being used, especially the coded language. How people grabbed that and started talking about any discussion of race as critical race theory is a politicized effort to shut people down. Because for whatever reason, there's still tremendous fear about learning about our past. And so my answer is there are efforts being made still, despite the governor trying to stop it. There are efforts still being made to ensure that that history is not only taught, but that we expose and expand the message to increasingly more people. And the ones who matter the most are those of you who are young in this audience. You're the ones who need to know this information. My generation will be passing. Many are already dying. Your generation is on the upswing. And you are the future. And I challenge you, like all the people I talked about challenged us, have a vision and be demanding. Thank you.